Hear me now? A little bit. Well, yes, okay. Very much appreciate the invitation to be here, and I really appreciate the efforts of the organizers in putting this together. I think it's a very valuable opportunity. I think it's something that the church really needs to take on. There's a lot of issues here that deserve some serious discussion within the Christian community. I'd like to start out by very emphatically stating that my work as a geologist I'm not a Christian who happens to be a geologist. I'm a geologist because I'm a Christian. It is my spiritual Christian vocation. And I think it's critical that we kind of dispense with the kind of secular sacred distinction in our lives, where we compartmentalize our lives into different pieces, and we have a religious life, our church life, and we have a professional life or a working life. It shouldn't be that way. That we are a whole people, and our ministry is a holistic one, and that whatever you choose as your role, your work, your profession, your personal ministry is your vocation, whatever that is. And I definitely view what I do as a scientist, whether I'm doing my science, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm in a public venue, all of that I understand and comprehend as part of my specific Christian vocation. And that is really a subset of the point that I'm really trying to communicate this afternoon, which is that the whole very popular, very widely viewed tension or conflict or warfare between science and faith is completely false. It's historically false. It's a myth. And that one thing I'm going to try to do here is very quickly, very briefly, run through the history of early geology and try to make the point that geology, as well as all the sciences, developed within a Christian context or a theistic context. And that, rather than science and faith being in this kind of perpetual historical conflict in which you have the progressive advance of scientific understanding at the expense of faith, expense of theology, that they're really complementary ways of understanding the reality of the universe. And I think that John Walton has made that point from his vantage point as a biblical scholar. I'm going to try to make the same point from the vantage point of a practicing scientist. So far from opposing science, I said they're Christian theology, and the historical development of the sciences went in harmony with each other. And sciences, in particular geology and paleontology, which is what I'm going to focus on, was largely developed in a theistic worldview and by devout Christians. So, could give you a brief historical kind of cliff notes of the early history of geology. And it's fascinating because it very much focuses on fossils, which is my area of interest. I'm a paleontologist. And discovering Earth history was a consequence of trying to understand the nature of fossils. And originally, the word fossil, this is back in the 1500s and before that, the word fossil literally means something dug up. Anything out of the ground is a fossil, right? And so clearly, there's a wide variety of fossil objects, things that today we would recognize by the definition of or term fossils, but anything out of the ground is a fossil. Archaeological artifacts, minerals, gemstones, they're all fossils because they all come out of the ground. So the question for the people at this time was not whether fossils represent the existence of once living things or not, but which ones do and how do we tell? And they had, it's kind of, John Walton was emphasizing, we have to put ourselves in those historical contexts, in those historical and cultural contexts to understand what was going on. If we try to understand what was happening in the 1500s or 1600s or 1700s, from our modern perspective, we'll get it all wrong, okay? And so I want to start in the 1500s. And in the 1500s, there's very much a sense of magical connections. I think magic is about the best way to express it. These hidden magical connections that kind of united all the objects in the universe, so that there were connections between astronomical bodies and human history, right? So you had the motions of the stars or constellations or planets impacting the course of human history. You had connections between celestial objects and earthly objects, between living and non-living, between animals and plants, all these kind of magical networks that connected things. And in addition, not only did they accept the idea of spontaneous generation for living things, but they also had no reason to reject the idea of spontaneous generation for the fossils themselves. They could grow, a fossil fish could grow within the rock, and there was no philosophical or objection to that possibility. So to kind of give you a sense of that, this is one of the very first compendiums or encyclopedias of fossil objects by a guy named Conrad Gessner in 1565. And this is the frontispiece, or the cover sheet for that encyclopedia, and you can see the word fossi there. It's all written in Latin. So this is a book of fossil objects. This is the front page. What's on the front page? Those don't look like fossils. Yeah, those are gemstones. And they're not just gemstones, they're birthstones. Okay? Those are gemstones that are connected to the zodiac, which gave those particular gemstones particular magical, mystical powers. There's also a signet ring with a scarab on it. Scarab had a lot of kind of particularly Egyptian kind of mysticism associated. So these are particularly interesting and important fossil objects, because they had these special magical properties. That's why they're on the cover. This is another page. This looks more like what we would expect in an encyclopedia of fossils. So fossil objects at the bottom, but interestingly enough, at the top are drawings of living animals, sea urchins in this case, and making the comparison and similarity between those living things and those fossil objects. But that similarity in appearance didn't necessarily imply to the people at the time that they were related as far as their origin. That didn't necessarily mean that those fossil objects were the remains of once living organisms. They shared a magical connection, affinity, but there's no reason why those fossils didn't grow in the rocks completely independently of living things. So there's all these problems that faced someone who was trying to understand the origin of these very interesting objects that people were gathering out of the ground. And these are some of them. Why are there some fossils that look kind of organic? They look like they might have been living, but there's nothing living today that looks like these. Okay, these are very strange things. We don't know anything around us that looks like this. So that's called the problem of form. Why do these things look so weird, so different? Some of them are made up of mineral compositions that they knew living organisms don't make. So how'd that happen? And biggest problem of all, how did they get in the rocks? How do those fossil objects get in the rocks? And here are just some illustrations of those kind of visual representations of those problems. Here's a problem of form. Okay, these are extinct groups of fossils for which there is no modern relative or nothing that looks like them today. And so, looking at this, they didn't see anything around them that looked like this. So there was no necessary reason to see them as having been once living. Problem of composition and the preservation of fossils. Very often there's mineralogical changes that occur. The shells are replaced by other minerals. There's chemical changes occur. So that you get things, for example, the fossils on the right that are now composed of iron pyrite or fool's gold, or they're composed of silica. Okay? Those weren't the original compositions. And of course, how did the fossils get in the rocks? Well, this leads us to a really cool story. A guy named Nicholas Steno from the 1600s. And one of the things that is important to realize about this time is that those who were educated, the educated people of the time, were theologians. They're theologians, pastors, or physicians, basically. Those are the kind of two professions that you would enter into if you were an educated person. And oftentimes they're the same thing. You know, your local pastor was also the community physician. Nicholas Steno went on to become a Catholic bishop and involved in evangelism for the faith. He ultimately died, lived a very ascetic life, had health problems, and died fairly early in his life. But he was also very involved in understanding the natural world. And much of his early work had to do with anatomy. He did some of the earliest work on understanding aspects of the human anatomy, doing dissections and things, and publishing articles on human anatomy. And he would have been the local physician in his area where he lived in Tuscany, Italy. But yet, he's kind of recognized as one of the founders of geology. And how that came to be is very, very interesting. So there he is, after he had become bishop. And of all things, it began with a shark's head. So the way this happened is fisherman was out in the Mediterranean, caught this big shark, thought it was really interesting. Didn't have a way to save the whole thing, so he lopped off its head and came in to shore. And what do you do if you have a curiosity that you want to have explained? Well, you take it to the local authority, and the local authority is going to be the head of the church or the local physician, who was Steno. So he brought the head to Steno. And Steno then dissected the shark's head. And what he found was he was really intrigued by the teeth and the jaws of this thing. And he said that the teeth in this shark look just like these fossils that are weathering out of the cliffs near the coast of Tuscany that are called tungstones. And they had all kind of magical and mystical origins, the tongues of serpents and all kinds of weird things that fell down from heaven during thunderstorms. You know, all these kind of creative ways of understanding where these things came from. And he said, you know, these shark's teeth look like smaller examples of these tungstones. Well, there's one of those, quote, tungstones to the left. It's a lot bigger than a modern shark's teeth, right? So this would have had to have been a really, really big shark. But otherwise, they're very, very similar. Well, he wasn't satisfied with that, just saying they looked alike. So he had to deal with those problems that we just talked about. Here's his drawing, his illustration of that shark's head. It looks kind of fanciful to us, but this was kind of the standard, illustration techniques of the time. And below there, he illustrates the teeth. So in order to make this comparison between these shark's teeth and these tongue stones that people were finding, again, he had to be able to answer those questions. The one with form is fairly easy. It's just pretty much a matter of size, right? So living shark's teeth look just like the tongue stones, except the tongue stones are just a lot bigger. But the other problems still remained. Composition problems, and how did they get in the rock? Well, for the composition, he argued that chemical compounds could penetrate into those original teeth, and there could be chemical changes occur, volatilization, which means certain elements could be removed by turning into gases, and you could have chemical reactions occurring to change the chemical composition of those teeth. But he spent a lot of his time saying, how did they get in the rocks? And so I said, well, what if those rocks were originally deposited from water, and those rocks represent sediments, mud and sand, kind of raining out of the water. And then if you have sharks dying or shedding their teeth, they could fall to the bottom of that and get covered up with a sediment, and that could be then compacted and turned into rock. And that's how the fossils could get inside the rock. And then there must have been something else happening in order to lift those fossil-bearing sediments up above sea level, where they were today. And what's really cool about steno, and it really shows how scientific investigation works, is that make an observation, you draw a conclusion, and then you say, well, if that's true, then what's the implication of that, right? And you keep following it step by step, right? Keep following your implications and testing them as you go. And that's what he did. He didn't leave it there. He said, okay, well, if these rocks were formed by sediments raining out of water, raining out of a fluid, what are some ways that would behave? What would be the result of that, the consequence of that? And he came up with what are now considered the foundational principles of historical geology. And they're listed there. Okay? Original horizontality, lateral continuity, and superposition. So I'm going to go through each one of these. What do these mean? Start with the last one there, superposition. Okay? If you are creating sedimentary rocks by raining sediments out of the overlying water column, right? The sediments on the bottom had to be put there first, right? And then each layer subsequently on top of that has to be progressively younger. So imagine, let's say, if I gave you a jar, a glass jar, and had a whole lot of layers of colored sand in there, right? And I said, which layer did I put in the jar first? Everyone would say the one at the bottom, right? That's the reasonable conclusion if those sediments were deposited out of a water column in succession. The ones in the bottom have to be older. That's the idea of superposition. So that if we have a sequence of rocks, okay, sequence of sedimentary rocks, that the ones in the bottom represent the first, earliest, and as you go up that stack, you get progressively younger. And that will be absolutely critical. The idea of lateral continuity. Okay, if you look at a landscape, there's Grand Canyon, right? You can look across that, and you can trace the same rock layer across the canyon. Well, what he said is those rock layers wouldn't have just stopped. They weren't created that way, right? That canyon wasn't created like that with those rock layers just ending. Originally, those layers were continuous across that surface, which meant that canyon had to be eroded through them. And so all those rocks in between where the person that took the picture is standing and on the other side of the canyon, all those rocks had to be removed because they originally were continuous. In other words, rock layers just don't stop and start. They make continuous, laterally continuous layers. Also, if you're depositing sediments out of the water column, gravity is going to cause those layers to form horizontally, or at least roughly horizontal, as they're raining out by the force of gravity. So the original orientation of those layers is going to be horizontal. Usually they're not. In Kansas they are mostly, but not usually. So what that means then, right, if those rocks were originally deposited horizontally, something happened, right? They were deposited horizontally, then something had to happen to tilt them. There had to be a subsequent event. So by law of superposition, you'd start down at the lower left, and each one of those layers represents progressively moving through time. So you're going up in time events from left to right, depositing all those layers, and then all those layers had to be tilted as a separate event after all those other layers were first formed. Or if you find them folded up like that, they were originally deposited horizontal, some other event had to happen in order to deform them. I hope what you're seeing here is the beginning of history. Before Steno, as far as people were concerned, there was no such thing as Earth history. There was no principles upon which it could be read or interpreted. None of these principles, someone had to think of them, and it was Steno that thought of them. So before Steno, there was no Earth history because people had no tools to see it. It was invisible to them. But just these very simple, basic rules or principles that came from trying to figure out how shark's teeth got into the sediments eroding from the cliff resulted in these principles. The consequence of that is the rock record was now a timeline. Okay? There was Earth history. He invented Earth history. Earth history now existed. There's a way to read it. There's a way to read what we call relative time. In other words, the order in which events occurred. This layer was deposited, this layer was deposited, these layers were folded up, then they were eroded off, these layers, you get a sequence of events. Steno made that possible. And again, this was all done within his theological worldview. And so he saw history as being directional, as having a beginning, moving through history in a particular direction with a consummation. And so the history that could now be read from the rocks is a part of that history, part of the creative history. Okay, fast forward to the 1700s. By now, fossils are widely recognized as the remains of once living things. Steno had resolved that problem. And using Steno's principles, people were now actively trying to work out the Earth history using those principles. And again, because the history that they had by which to approach this question was human history. And so logically, at first, they didn't see any discontinuity between Earth history and human history. They were the same thing. And therefore, there were efforts to try to understand, initially trying to understand the geologic history in terms of things like Noah's flood, global deluge. And there were a number of unresolved questions, very high on the list of which was the problem of extinction. Because now that they could more confidently look at the geologic record, fossil record, and say, these organisms were once living things. We still had the problem of form in that there were all these fossils that didn't exist in their world. And for a while, the argument was, well, we don't know the whole world yet. There's lots of the world we don't know. And these organisms were probably living in other places that we just haven't visited, right? By the 1700s, that's kind of hard to say, right? Because now the Europeans have gone out, they've seen most of the world, and so the idea that you had all these completely unknown animals and plants living somewhere in the world that just hadn't been discovered wasn't really viable anymore as an option. So the question is, what happened to them? Where did they go? And this is a theological problem because at the time they were very much influenced by Greek philosophy. A lot of their ideas of perfection were drawn not from Scripture but from Greek philosophy. And one of the ideas in applying the idea of perfection to God and God's creation was that creation would be as full and diverse as possible, and that anything that God would create, if it's created perfectly, couldn't die, couldn't go extinct. So extinction to them was a violation of the perfection of God. Because if God made a creation and there were parts of this creation that no longer existed, that implied some error, some imperfection in the original creation. So this created theological problems. Okay, another person in the 1700s that's important is a guy named James Hutton. He was a Scottish philosopher, and he added on to some of the principles that had been developed by Steno, kind of expanding those. I'll show us a few of those. And he developed, worked out the concept called uniformitarianism, which is very widely misunderstood. Hopefully I can clarify some of that. And there is Hutton, portrait of Hutton from that time. And some of the additional principles that Hutton discovered to add on to those suggested by Steno was principle of cross-cutting relationships. Again, these are all very common sense once you hear them. So it's saying, okay, you can see that inclined layer, that's actually originally an igneous, it's called an intrusion. It's originally molten material that was squeezed up into the rocks and then solidified. But the important concept here is anything that cuts across another unit has to be younger than the unit that it cuts across. Another way to say that is that intrusion can't intrude something that isn't there. That section of rocks has to exist before something can intrude it. Again, perfectly obvious. Similarly, if you have a fault, that fault has to happen after those rock layers are formed. You can't fault something that doesn't exist. You can't fold something that doesn't exist, right? Very obvious. But what it does is it adds other criteria by which you can work out the relative history, okay? And what Hutton did was seeing these kind of relationships. He worked in Scotland, and seeing these kind of relationships in the rocks that he was looking at, and he recognized what are called, now we call, or he coined the term unconformities, which are erosion layers. And what he recognized is there's periods of deposition where you deposit a number of rock layers and they get deformed in some way, then they can get eroded, then you deposit another set of rock layers on top of those. Those may be also subsequently eroded. And so that these surfaces, erosion surfaces, had to require a lot of time to happen. So here's one of his early illustrations. And so what you see at the bottom are these rock layers that are tilted up almost vertically. Actually, they're very tightly folded so that the rock layers now look like they're standing on end. And then you see that kind of rubbly layer in there, and that represents, cobbles and gravel and stuff that was eroded from those lower layers and was actually a soil, an ancient fossil soil horizon. So this was a landscape at that time. And then on top of it are another set of marine rock layers. So what that means is, first you had to deposit all those rocks at the bottom. Then you had to fold them or deform them so they're now standing up vertical. Then you had to erode the surface off flat, develop a land surface. Then you had to subside that whole land surface, deposit another set of rocks on top of that, and then actually tilt that one. Okay? So what this implied to Hutton was, wow, that took a long time to happen. And this is actually near that location. I had the privilege a few years ago to be able to kind of walk through some of the areas that Hutton visited during his researches. And this place called Sicker Point in Scotland. What you see at the bottom, it's a little hard to see in this image, is those vertically oriented rock layers. And then there's the erosion surface that eroded those off. And then you see another set of rock layers deposited on top that are also themselves slightly tilted. Here's that same unit in another location. So you can see the near vertical rocks at the bottom, then that surface where they're cut off, and then new sediments deposited on top, and then that whole thing tilted. And it was these particular locations, these are the very places that Hutton visited where he went, wow, that took a long time. These are all over the world. I mean, these are abundant features of the geologic record. There's the Grand Canyon. It's called the Great Unconformity at the base of the Grand Canyon. You see the inclined layers at the bottom, and then there's the erosion surface at the top, and then a series of more flat-lying rocks sitting on top of that. So again, these imply great spans of time in order to happen. Another thing that, as I said, that Hutton introduced is this idea of uniformitarianism. And this, again, is very commonly misunderstood. It really had several components, one of which is sometimes called actualism, which means that you use your understanding of present processes, of how you observe the world working now, and you use that as a basis to go back and interpret the past. Okay, so commonly the phrase is, the present is the key to the past. Okay? So we have to understand how the world works now. We have to understand how geology works now, how deposition and erosion and deformation and all those kinds of things happen now. And then we can go back in the past and use that insight in order to understand the past. Okay? And that is fundamental to geology. It's fundamental to any science when you're trying to reconstruct the past. Another aspect of uniformitarianism, as proposed by Hutton, was this idea of uniformity of rate, okay? Which he went the further step to say, okay, not only can I use these processes that are acting today to interpret the past, but I'm going to assume that the rate at which those processes happened was uniform over time, okay? That aspect of Hutton's views was rejected. That part of Hutton's views is not part of modern geology. Actualism is, but not uniformity of rate. There are certain things that are uniformities of rate, chemical reactions and physical relationships and things. But geologic processes, we don't assume that there was a uniformity of rate. Okay, back on? Okay. So I just put these up just to show very quickly how we use actualism today, right? So on the two top panels are images of modern sediments. So these are sedimentary features that are forming today. We know how they're forming. We can watch them happen. We can model them in the lab. We can reproduce them. We know how they're formed in the modern environment. And we can go into the geologic record and see the identical features. Okay? So, for example, on the left side are sediments that were deposited by a flowing river, meandering river system. Well, we see the precise features, what we call sedimentary structures, in the geologic record, and then we can conclude that these were formed in the same kind of environment. We can even make conclusions as far as how fast the water was flowing and how deep it was and things like that, because the nature of those structures varies with water velocities. Okay? On the right side are sand dunes. Okay? So at the top is a cross-section of a modern sand dune, has certain characteristic features that distinguish it from other types of depositional environments. We can go into the geologic record and find precisely the same features. Again, we see those precise same features, and we therefore imply that they were formed in a similar way by a similar process. That's actualism. Same thing, the top two are modern environments, the bottom two are fossil, or from the geologic record. Mud cracks on the left with footprints. Same thing down in the lower left. Rippled sand layers on a coastline. Again, the same thing, same identical kind of ripples from the geologic record. So again, that's how actualism works. So Hutton provided those kinds of additional tools, a part of our toolkit to unlock the past. And made this very famous statement, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end when looking at Earth history. And what he's not saying is that he thought the universe was eternal, or the physical universe was eternal. He did not believe that. That isn't what he meant. What he meant was, I can't see it. Earth history is so vast, so much has happened, that I can't see that far back. It's lost. You know, you keep going back, it's kind of like tracing your family tree. You know, you reach a point where you just don't have it, you just lose it, right? I can't go back any farther. So he just thought, you know, the beginning is too far back. I can't see it. And similarly, I don't know where it's going. I don't know what the future holds. This leads us into another extremely important person in the history of geology, paleontology, named Cuvier, Georges Cuvier. He was a French anatomist, lived in an incredibly interesting time. If you look at those dates, you realize an awful lot happened during his lifetime, and he was French. So we have things like the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror and Napoleon and the reestablishment of the monarchy, and all that happened during his lifetime. And he didn't lose his head during the entire time, amazingly. He was probably the greatest anatomist of the time, and sometimes considered the greatest anatomist that ever lived. He had access to the world's museums. As Napoleon was going out conquering the world, he sent all the stuff back to the museums of France, and Cuvier was in charge. And he developed the modern sciences of functional and comparative anatomy, comparing detailed comparisons between organisms, looking at their similarities and differences. There's a portrait of Cuvier. And one of the critical things he did, from our perspective, from Earth history, is that he was the first person to reconstruct fossil vertebrates. These bones have been found for, ages. People have been collecting bones and attributing them to dragons and cyclopses and all kinds of things and mystical beings. And he was the first one to start taking these bones because of his understanding of anatomy, his experience in seeing a vast range of living organisms, to be able to see how those bones could be assembled and put together. So he had this idea of correlation of parts, which meant that every bone in your anatomy, every bone in an organism is connected to another bone in a very specific way. So you can start with one bone and you can kind of predict what the next bone is going to be like. And so what he was able to do is take these bones. You normally don't find extremely rare to find fossil vertebrates all kind of laid out like it was in Jurassic Park, where they take their little broom and it's a perfect velociraptor. That doesn't happen. You just have scattered bones, right? And so he was able to take those and assemble them and reconstruct the past in a very visceral, visual kind of way. And the first thing he did was reassemble these organisms from what we would call the Pleistocene today, what they called the surficial gravels. So one thing that he did was compare them to what he knew. So what we have here is, at the top, is a jaw from a mammoth, and at the bottom is an Indian elephant. So we made two conclusions. One is, the thing at the top, that fossil jaw, is a fossil elephant, but it's not a living fossil elephant. It doesn't look like any of the living elephants. So this is raising this question of extinction. In fact, he was able to then reconstruct whole organisms. This is reconstruction of a mastodon. And what he realized is that these was an extinct fauna, a whole group of extinct organisms that no longer live. And it was pretty hard to argue that these things were still wandering the world someplace that hadn't been discovered. And so he was the person who finally convinced people that extinction was real, that really was a past, a living past of organisms that are no longer living. So the past was different than the present, that life had changed. These are, the top two are skulls of living sloths. The bottom one is the skull of a ground sloth, which are huge things. And he recognized it was a sloth again, but that it was not like anything living. So again, an extinct fauna. Here is the whole skeleton of the ground sloth. Giant armadillos, called glyptodonts. A whole fauna. Deer, woolly rhinos, all kinds of things. So then, again, everyone understood Steno's principles. As the further you go down, the farther you're going back in time. So we started looking at rocks that were older, that is underneath the surficial gravels, and older rocks going down. So we know we're going back in time because we're going down in the rocks. And what he found was each time he went to older and older rocks and started reconstructing the organisms, they were different. And the further he went back in time, they got increasingly different from things that are living today. So in 1801, he made this statement: the older the beds in which these bones are found, the more they differ from those we know of animals we know today. The further you go back, the weirder things get. Okay? So these were now rock layers older than those surficial gravels, we call the tertiary today. And it's recognizing mammals, but they didn't easily fit into modern groups. You'd say, well, it's a parasodactyl and artiodactyl, so a single-hoofed, odd-toed herbivore or an even-toed herbivore, but they didn't fit into modern categories. They were kind of amalgams or had shared features of different groups today in a single animal. So here's one of those called Paleotherium, which just means ancient beast, really original name. But again, these were, it was a hoofed herbivore, but it didn't fit into any modern categories. Same thing with the carnivores. And then you go back even further into what was called the Cretaceous chalks, which are yet older. And now things got really weird. okay? Didn't find any mammals at all. Everything was dominated by reptiles, really strange reptiles. The chalks were marine units, so these are marine reptiles. Things like mosasaurs. It really captures the excitement that existed this time. And this, imagine, wake up tomorrow and the headline in the newspaper reads, undeniable dragon skeleton found in China. How that would hit the press, right? Wow, we thought they were, But that's the kind of thing that was happening here. These were bizarre, completely amazing animals that had no parallel on Earth today, and they were real, right? So things like mosasaurs, these giant marine lizards. There's the illustration by Cuvier of one of these mosasaurs. Ichthyosaurs, again, another kind of swimming reptile, kind of looks superficially like a dolphin, but it's completely unrelated. It's a reptile. Again, other kind of bizarre swimming reptiles, flying reptiles, pterodactyls. So this another whole community, a whole ecosystem of extinct organisms. So we start out with Steno. Steno gave us Earth history. Steno gave us a timeline. It's a timeline without dates. It's just saying this happened, and this happened, and this happened. So we have a timeline, and we can put events on that timeline. There's no dates. It's just a relative timeline. Now on that relative timeline, we can put the fossil record. So we can say these animals lived, then these animals lived, then these animals lived, then these animals lived, and there's a directional history. So not only is a directional history to the physical Earth, but there's a directional history to life on Earth. Cuvier, remember when he lived? What he saw is these successive communities of extinct organisms. And his response was that these were revolutions in Earth history. That's what his whole life was. French Revolution, Napoleon. I mean, his life was nothing but revolutions. So it also shows how the culture of the time, the politics, that science, like everything, is cited in a particular time and a particular place. And it's influenced by that culture. And so he used this concept of revolutions to understand Earth history. And so he saw a whole sequence of these revolutions in which past life was swept away and replaced by a different group of organisms. And he saw the last one of those revolutions as being Noah's flood. But Cuvier never addressed the question of where the new species came from. He didn't address that question. What that understanding of the history of life did was now provide a way to link things together, what we call correlate from one place to another. Because what they found was that regardless of where he goes, now that everyone is starting to look at the fossil record and see how different fossils appear in the geologic record according to their position, right? And what they found was, regardless of where you went on the Earth, those different communities of organisms always appeared in the same order. They were never mixed up. They were never out of order. They were always in the same sequence. And therefore, if you found this set of fossil organisms, you knew you were in the same time period. That was the basis of creation of the geologic timescale. So all the periods, the geologic periods, were defined and still are defined on the basis of their fossil content. Okay? Now, one thing that is often very commonly misunderstood about this is this had absolutely nothing to do with evolutionary theory, which had not yet been accepted. That was a later understanding. And that this system of correlation, of putting together the geologic timescale, would work even if fossils weren't the remains of once living organisms. In fact, the person who made the first geologic maps used them as though they might as well have been, screws and bolts and nails and washers. That, the layer of washers always came before the layer of bolts everywhere you go. So I'm going to map the layer of washers. I'm going to make a map to show where the layer of washers is. I'm going to make a map showing where the layer of bolts are. That's exactly how they used it. And it was used for entirely practical purposes, like where to find mineable ores, where to find coal, where to find building stone. Okay? So the fossils were used just as markers in order to find your place. And so by 1814, about 1840s and the latter half of the 1800s, the modern geologic timescale was worked out. It was worked out within decades of Cuvier's work. And what's important is that the people who did that were Christians. And were doing it completely within their theological worldview. This is kind of repeating what I already said. This is one of the first maps, or the first map of Britain that was done on that basis. Also starting to make cross-sections. None of this was possible before this ability to use fossils to recognize where you were. Two of the most important people in the development of the geologic timescale was Roderick Murchison and Adam Sedgwick. Sedgwick was actually the, I think he was the dean of Christ Church, I'm not sure. But he's a theologian as well as a geologist, as most of these people were. They had theological training as well as scientific training. And here's a quote of Sedgwick's to show his perspective about what he was doing as a geologist, this brand new, exciting science of geology. He says, "No opinion can be a heretical, but that which is not true. Conflicting falsehoods we can comprehend, but truths can never war against each other. I affirm, therefore, that we have nothing to fear from the results of our inquiries, provided they be followed in the laborious but secure road of honest induction. In this way, we may rest assured that we shall never arrive at conclusions opposed to any truth, either physical or moral, from whatever source that truth may be derived." Okay? So that there was no sense of conflict in his mind about pursuing the understanding the Earth history and his theology. Because all truth is God's truth, and truth cannot war against truth. William Buckland came in subsequent to that, and Buckland is kind of significant because he was one of the last geologists of the 1800s that was still arguing for an important role of Noah's flood in the geologic record. And like Cuvier, he and Cuvier had similar views on this, is that these superficial gravels were produced by the Noachian flood. And it was sometimes it's called diluvium. And the short story, long story short, is that as he continued to pursue his study, look at the fossil record from this time period, he began to understand that these fossil deposits that he was looking at were not deposited by a flood. That they had were accumulated in other ways. For example, he looked at a lot of cave deposits, which he originally thought were the flood waters rushing into caves and carrying the bones of animals into the caves. And later, by looking at very, very detailed study of these bones, he recognized that these were hyena dens, and that the hyenas were bringing their prey into the dens, and that these showed the evidence of being gnawed and carried and manipulated by hyenas. So they weren't washed in by water. And there's a cartoon of the time related to that, his work there. And then within his lifetime, other work by other geologists recognized that these superficial gravels were actually deposited by ice. By comparing, again, this actualism, by looking at ice deposits, sediments along the edges of glaciers, and recognizing that the sediments they were looking at were actually formed by what we now call the Pleistocene Ice Age, and that they were deposited by melting ice. And so the flood no longer was seen as having a geologic record. That doesn't mean that people dismissed the existence of a flood, but that it did not leave a record. It did not leave a geologic record. So what was the response of theologians to this? As we've already seen, there are lots of ways of understanding Scripture, understanding the opening chapters of Genesis. And these are already in existence, and some were understood to be compatible with the new science of geology and other things that were being found. Two of the most common interpretations at this time, the late 1800s, was the day-age theory and the gap theory, which is also called the ruin restoration model. These were very popularly held, very commonly held at this time, in which the days of Genesis were periods of time, or that all of Earth history can be compressed between the first verse of Genesis and the second verse of Genesis. And that was called the gap theory, that you could fit all of Earth history into that world, that ancient world was destroyed and then recreated beginning in verse 2. These two views still exist today. They're still promoted by some people today, but have been superseded in a lot of ways by a lot of new interpretations and understandings of Genesis, as we've seen with John Walton's presentation. The conclusion of this is that by the end of the 1800s, there were virtually no Christian scientists or theologians who argued for a young, recently created Earth. Virtually non-existent. And that evangelical theologians, including those that strenuously argued for biblical inerrancy and divine inspiration of Scripture, had absolutely no trouble with an ancient Earth. It was a non-issue. In fact, many of as far as I know, all of the authors of the group of publications called the Fundamentals that was written towards the end of the 1800s had no problem with an ancient Earth. A number of the people who were writing for the Fundamentals, and the Fundamentals were basically a reaction against modern biblical and literary criticism, which was rising at that point in significance and influence. And so this was a theological response to critiques of the historicity of Scripture, of biblical inerrancy, of miracles, of the divinity of Christ, of the resurrection. These things were all coming to a head, and there was these movements that were threatening those understandings of Scripture. And so the evangelical Reformed theologians at the time got together and put together this series of volumes called the Fundamentals. B.B. Warfield was one of them. He was in Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a very strong advocate for the Bible as the inspired and inerrant Word of God. Inerrancy was one of his main emphases. James Orr, he was from Glasgow, Scottish Presbyterian. Both of these individuals, as well as a number of others, made important contributions to the Fundamentals. This is a statement by James Orr. When I am asked, as I sometimes am, which of these articles of evangelical faith I am prepared to part with at the insistence of modern thought and in the interest of reconstructed theology, I answer with fullest confidence, none of them. Okay? So these were very conservative, evangelical people who were convinced of the inspiration of Scripture and, in fact, biblical inerrancy, and yet none of them had trouble with an ancient earth. It was a non-issue. So, how much time do I have here? Okay. So what I want to end with here is how do we get from there to here? One of those is that among the other events that happened at the end of the 1800s was the rise of this warfare view of science and faith, which was largely stimulated by the writings of these two authors, William Draper and Andrew Dickinson White. These were polemical writings. They were written as a history, but they were polemical, and many of the science warfare kind of myths or stories that you hear had their origin there with those authors and some others. And this has been studied extensively by modern historians, and their work has been recognized as highly biased. Some of their work was outright fabricated. Stories that they wrote as history were fabrications. And yet those myths continue and continue to bolster and support this idea that science and faith were always in this perpetual warfare with each other. Again, this is the fundamentals. And what I want to end with here is this idea of continuous creation. I think John Walton alluded to it. And it was a foundational approach that most of these theologians made, and evangelical theologians to this day, which is that God is active everywhere, all the time, in all that happens. Okay? God is continuously, creatively active. That creation isn't something that is an interruption. That God does not intervene in the history, either in natural history or human history, in the sense of God was stepping outside and then kind of shows up and does something and then steps out again, right? God is always there. You can't intervene if you're already there, okay? So really what a view of God is only active in these interventions is you basically end up with episodic deism. You know, most of the time, God is tuned out, uninvolved, out there someplace, and every now and then he jumps in to kind of fix things. And then he hops back out and lets things run. Continuous creation says God's there intimately, actively, all the time in human history and natural history. God is the ground upon which reality exists. I mean, some people say if God would withdraw his presence from the natural world would simply cease to exist. It's upheld in its very existence by God's activity. And so if you approach the natural world from that perspective, it's not like you're going into some area in which God isn't present. God is actively present, excitingly, wondrously present in everything that's happening. So that transforms your approach to understanding the natural world, because you're kind of thinking God's thoughts after him. And again, truth can't war against truth. So I'll end there.